Every morning at exactly 6:45 a.m., an elderly man named Harold Bennett shuffles into his small kitchen in Portland, Oregon. 90 years old, his steps are slow but deliberate. The kettle whistles faintly, the aroma of freshly ground beans fills the air, and two ceramic mugs sit side by side on the wooden table, worn from decades of use. Harold pours coffee into both cups, one for himself and one for someone who is no longer there. He does this ritual with the precision of a soldier, as though missing a step would dishonor a sacred duty. Neighbors who happen to pass his window in those early hours sometimes see the silhouette of a tall, thin man with neatly combed white hair, wearing the same navy blue cardigan he always wears. They notice that he talks softly while sipping his coffee, glancing at the chair across from him. Most assume it is just a quirk of old age, a lonely widower passing time. But Harold knows it is more than that. It is the way he continues a promise that began nearly 70 years earlier. On September 22, 2023, Harold's story would step out from the shadows of his quiet kitchen into the glaring lights of a television stage. That Friday morning, the Family Feud studios in Atlanta buzzed with energy. The Bennett family of Portland had flown in to compete against the Santos family from Miami. The audience was rowdy, excited, clapping their hands to the warm-up host's jokes, not yet aware that what they were about to witness would transcend the game show entirely. Among the Bennett clan, there was one member who stood out before a single question was asked. Harold, their patriarch, walked slowly but upright to the podium, his cardigan pressed, his white shirt crisp, his posture dignified. At 90 years old, he did not slouch, nor did he seek attention. He simply carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had lived through wars, raised children, buried friends, and still rose every morning with purpose. His granddaughter Emma had been the one to persuade him to join the show. He had resisted, claiming he was too old, that his life belonged in private, not on television. But Emma had insisted, "Grandpa, the world needs to hear your story." From the moment he appeared on stage, Steve Harvey seemed drawn to him. Steve had met thousands of contestants in his years as host, but something in Harold's demeanor, calm, steady, almost regal, commanded respect. Steve, never shy with words, grinned and addressed him directly. "Mr. Harold, you look absolutely fantastic for 90 years old. What's your secret, sir?" The audience laughed warmly, waiting for a witty reply. Harold smiled gently, that quiet, knowing smile that would later move millions. "My wife Dorothy taught me how to take care of myself, Mr. Steve," he said, "and she's still teaching me, just from a different place now." The crowd chuckled, thinking it a charming way of acknowledging she had passed. Steve chuckled too, nodding in respect, unaware of the weight behind Harold's words. But those closest to him, the Bennett children, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren, exchanged glances. They knew what Steve did not, that every morning at 6:45, Harold's world paused in remembrance of Dorothy. The game began, filled with the usual cheer and banter. The Santos family danced and shouted across the stage. The Bennetts answered questions with enthusiasm. But even in the lively chaos, Harold's presence was magnetic. His family watched him with love and pride. Audience members leaned forward when he spoke, as though his soft voice carried greater meaning than the loudest cheer. Each time he patted his grandson's shoulder or whispered encouragement, the cameras lingered. This was more than just a contestant. This was a man whose story stretched far beyond the flashing scoreboard. As the competition tightened, it became clear the outcome would come down to fast money. Harold's grandson went first, scoring an impressive 162 points, leaving Harold to bring home just 38 more. Steve walked to Harold's side with a playful but respectful grin. "Mr. Harold, you ready to finish this for the Bennett family?" Harold adjusted his cardigan, placed both hands on the podium, and nodded. "I'll do my very best, Mr. Steve." The questions began, and Harold answered with sharp wit that belied his age. "Name something people take to work in the morning." "A bag." The board lit up, 42 points. "Name a place people love to visit on vacation." "The beach." Another 35 points. "Name something old you might find in someone's home." "Photo albums." Another 28 points. The scoreboard soared past 200, securing the $20,000 prize. The Bennett family erupted in celebration, hugging, clapping, laughing. But Steve still had 2 questions left, and it was here, in this ordinary segment of a game show, that something extraordinary began to unfold. Steve leaned in. "Mr. Harold, what's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning?" For the first time all night, Harold paused. His eyes flickered to the audience, then to his family, then back to Steve. His smile faded just slightly, replaced by an expression of deep emotion. He took a slow breath as though preparing himself for something sacred. "Every morning at exactly 6:45, Harold said quietly, his voice trembling but steady, "I wake up and make 2 cups of coffee, one for me and one for my wife Dorothy. Then I sit down at the table across from her chair, and we have our coffee together just like we did for 67 years. The studio fell utterly silent. The laughter and cheering evaporated. You could hear the faint hum of the stage lights, the breath of the audience as they leaned forward, stunned. Even Steve Harvey, known for his quick comebacks, froze, the card slipping in his hand. Something in Harold's voice, steady but aching, told everyone this was more than nostalgia. This was devotion. This was a love story breaking through the walls of a game show, commanding everyone's attention. Steve set down his card slowly and stepped closer. "Mr. Harold, when did you lose Dorothy?" Harold's eyes glistened. He swallowed hard, his voice heavy but unbroken. 5 years, 3 months, and 7 days ago, Mr. Steve, but some rituals don't end with death. So, I still have coffee with her every morning at 6:45. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Tears streamed down faces in the audience. Crew members behind the cameras wiped their eyes. In that moment, Family Feud was no longer a game show. It was a cathedral, and Harold had become its quiet preacher, reminding everyone that love, once true, never truly dies. The silence in the Family Feud studio lingered, heavy yet sacred, as Harold's words hung in the air. He had spoken them so simply, so softly, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. Steve Harvey moved beyond his usual poise, placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. The host's voice, usually booming with laughter, was hushed. "Tell us about Dorothy, Mr. Harold," he said gently. Harold's eyes softened. He looked not at Steve, nor at the cameras, but somewhere far away, into a memory that only he could see. His lips curved into a smile touched by both joy and sorrow. "I met Dorothy in 1956 at a little coffee shop in Portland. She was 20 years old, working behind the counter, wearing this blue apron that somehow made her eyes look even brighter. I was just a young naval engineer back then, freshly assigned to a dock project. I walked in one morning, half awake, needing coffee, and there she was, laughing at something her coworker said. I swear to you, I had never seen anyone laugh the way she did. It was like the world itself paused to listen. The studio leaned in. It was no longer a television audience. It was a congregation listening to Scripture. Harold's voice carried the rhythm of a story told countless times at family gatherings, but never before to the world. She poured my coffee, and she did it with such care. I remember she made a little swirl in the foam like a heart. I don't even think she realized she'd done it, but to me, it was a sign. That morning, we talked for 20 minutes. 20 minutes that felt like 20 years. We talked about books, about music, about the silly little things, and from that day on, every morning at 6:45, I was at that counter, and every morning she was there waiting. Harold's family was already in tears. His granddaughter Emma pressed her hand to her mouth. The Santos family across the stage clutched each other's hands. Even the cameramen, trained to remain detached, were fighting back emotion. Harold's voice grew steadier as he slipped deeper into memory. After 3 months of coffee at 6:45, I asked her to marry me, right there in that same shop. No ring yet, just words and the kind of certainty you don't argue with. She laughed at me. She said, "You don't even know if I take sugar in my coffee." And I said, "Dorothy, I'll spend the rest of my life learning exactly how you take it." She said yes, and for 67 years I kept that promise. The audience erupted in applause. Not the wild clapping of a game show, but the heartfelt recognition of a vow honored. Steve wiped his eyes, unable to hide his tears. "That's the most beautiful proposal I've ever heard, sir," he whispered. But Harold wasn't finished. He took a deep breath and pressed on, as though the story had been waiting all these years for this moment. Life wasn't always easy. We had 4 children, and sometimes money was tight. I was gone a lot with my naval engineering work. I saw more shipyards than living rooms in those years, but no matter where I was, I called Dorothy at 6:45. Sometimes from the other side of the world. Sometimes with static on the line. But always at that exact time, we shared our coffee, even if it was only in words. He paused, eyes shimmering with memory. The first coffee of the day was always the sweetest, Dorothy used to say, and she was right. Because it wasn't just coffee, it was a ritual, a reminder that no matter how far apart we were, we belonged to each other. Steve lowered his microphone, overcome, as the crowd wiped their tears. Harold pressed his palms on the podium, steadying himself. His voice dropped to a whisper. 7 years ago, she was diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. The doctors gave her 6 months, but you know what she said? She said, 6 months? That's at least 180 more mornings of coffee. And she fought for 2 years. Every day she got up at 6:45. Even when she was too weak to hold the cup, I held it for her. Even when she couldn't speak, she would smile, and I knew she was telling me, "Don't stop." The studio had gone beyond silence now. It was reverence, a holy stillness. People were openly crying, tissues rustling in every row. Harold's voice trembled as he approached the part of the story that even his family found hard to hear. The last morning, she couldn't get out of bed. I made her coffee like always, placed it beside her, and said, "Honey, your coffee is ready." She couldn't speak, but her eyes told me everything. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and I knew she was telling me to keep the ritual alive, to keep making that coffee no matter what. Harold stopped. His shoulders shook slightly, but he straightened himself with dignity. So the next morning, when the alarm went off at 6:45, I got up. I made 2 cups of coffee, one for me, one for her, and I sat at the table, staring at her empty chair, talking to her about the sunrise, about the birds, about how much I missed her. And I've done that every morning since. The audience broke. The sound of sobbing filled the room, mixed with applause, mixed with awe. Even the Santos family crossed the stage to stand with the Bennetts. A grandmother from their side took Harold's hand and whispered, "You are all of our hero." Steve Harvey, shaking his head as though in disbelief, set his cards down and embraced Harold right there on stage. "Mr. Harold," Steve said, his voice cracking, "you've just shown all of us what true devotion means. That's not just love. That's forever." And with those words, the Family Feud stage ceased being entertainment. It had become a sanctuary where an old man's ritual revealed the extraordinary beauty hidden in life's smallest, most ordinary moments. When Steve Harvey's arms wrapped around Harold Bennett, the entire Family Feud studio seemed to exhale at once. The applause rose slowly, like a tide, then thundered through the rafters. People stood, tears still streaking their faces, clapping not for the game, but for the story they had just witnessed. It was not the usual roar of a game show victory. It was the kind of ovation reserved for heroes, the kind given when a man's life becomes larger than the stage he stands on. The Bennett family crowded around Harold, their hands on his shoulders, their eyes shining with pride and grief interwoven. Across from them, the Santos family left their podium entirely. They joined the Bennetts in a circle around Harold, hugging him, shaking his hands, whispering blessings. Even the grandmother from the Santos side, who had already spoken through tears, pulled Harold into her arms again. "Senor Harold," she said softly, "your love has taught us all something tonight. You are not just your family's treasure. You are the world's." The cameras captured every moment, but even those behind the lenses were no longer professionals at work. Several cameramen had put their equipment down briefly to wipe their faces. The sound engineers, usually hidden in their booth, were visibly moved as well. For the first time in Family Feud history, the production itself seemed to stop, not because of a technical glitch, but because everyone present was simply overwhelmed by the sacredness of the moment. Steve Harvey cleared his throat, visibly shaken. He turned to the audience and then back to Harold. "Mr. Harold," he said, "we've asked you questions all night. But the truth is, you've already given us the answer that matters most. And it's not on the board, it's in your heart." The audience roared in agreement. The game had already been won, the $20,000 prize secure, but the questions still lay unfinished. Steve glanced down at his card as though almost embarrassed to return to the triviality of the game. Still, Harold stood tall at the podium, his hand steady. "Dorothy would want me to finish," he said quietly, with that unwavering dignity. "She never liked leaving things incomplete." Steve smiled faintly through tears and asked the final question. "Name something that makes a house feel like a home." Without hesitation, Harold answered, "Having someone to make morning coffee for, whether they're sitting across from you or watching from heaven." The board lit up. Family, 25 points. Their total soared to 292, far beyond the winning mark. But nobody cared about the number anymore. The room erupted in another standing ovation, longer and louder this time, the sound of hundreds of people acknowledging that what they had witnessed was not just entertainment, but a lesson in what it means to love. And then, something happened that no contestant before Harold had ever experienced. Steve Harvey set his cards down again, shaking his head as if overcome, and raised his microphone. "Mr. Harold," he announced, "the $20,000 is yours. But tonight, Family Feud wants to do more than hand out a prize. Tonight, in memory of your beloved Dorothy, we are creating something special." The lights dimmed slightly, and the screen behind them lit up with the words, "Dorothy's Morning Coffee Fund." Steve explained that the show, together with local sponsors, would be donating an additional $50,000 to the very coffee shop in Portland, where Harold and Dorothy had first met in 1956. The fund would provide free morning coffee for elderly couples, giving them their own sacred 645 ritual, a chance to create and cherish memories the way Harold and Dorothy had. Harold's hands flew to his face. Trembling, his shoulders shook as he tried to contain the sobs that broke free. "Dorothy would have loved that so much," he whispered. The audience roared with applause, and Emma, his granddaughter, clung to his arm as tears streamed down her face. Steve himself was crying openly now, unable to hide it. "Mr. Harold," he said, his voice breaking, "you've shown the world what love looks like when it doesn't stop at death. And tonight, Dorothy's story will help other couples hold on to their mornings just a little tighter." The applause went on for 10 minutes straight. 10 minutes in which no one in the studio sat down. No one looked away. Strangers embraced each other in the audience, husbands and wives, boyfriends and girlfriends, grandparents and grandchildren, all held hands tighter, reminded of the fragile, powerful beauty of small rituals that hold entire lives together. When the episode aired 4 weeks later, the reaction went far beyond the studio. Within 3 days, the clip of Harold's story had been shared 95 million times. The hashtag #TheMorningCoffeeRitual trended worldwide. News outlets replayed the footage endlessly, commentators marveling at the devotion of a 90-year-old man who still made coffee for his wife every morning 5 years after her passing. But more than views or shares, it sparked something deeper. Thousands of people wrote about their own rituals, about loved ones they had lost, about the small daily acts that became anchors of memory. In Portland, the original coffee shop where Harold and Dorothy had first met saw a flood of visitors. Couples came in at 6:45 a.m. sharp, ordering 2 cups of coffee in honor of Harold and Dorothy. Some came with partners, others came alone, holding photos of the ones they had lost, whispering words into empty chairs. The shop owner, moved by the outpouring, hung a new sign outside, "Dorothy and Harold's." Underneath, it read, "Love doesn't end at 6:45 a.m. It begins there." Harold never sought fame. He never wanted his life to be broadcast to millions, but in sharing the truth of his ritual, he had ignited something that stretched far beyond his own kitchen. His story was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone who had ever loved, lost, and held on through the small acts that outlive grief. And though the world celebrated him, Harold remained the same. Every morning at exactly 6:45 a.m., he rose quietly, put on his cardigan, and made 2 cups of coffee. He still spoke softly to Dorothy, telling her about the sunrise, about the grandchildren, about the news he'd read in the paper. The difference now was that somewhere out there, thousands of others were doing the same, inspired by the love story of a man who showed them that the smallest rituals are the ones that last forever. 6 months had passed since Harold Bennett's story first aired, but its ripple effects were still being felt across the globe. The clip of his quiet confession, making 2 cups of coffee every morning for his late wife Dorothy, had become more than a viral moment. It had become a movement. All over the world, people had begun creating their own morning rituals in memory of lost loved ones. Social media brimmed with stories of candles lit at dawn, songs played at the same hour, or handwritten notes left on kitchen tables. Couples who still had each other held tighter, aware now that even the smallest daily gesture could become an eternal memory. And yet, in the middle of all this, Harold remained unchanged. He still rose at 6:30 a.m., shuffled into his kitchen at 6:45, and made 2 cups of coffee with the care of a man handling holy objects. He still sat at the table across from Dorothy's chair, speaking softly as though she were there, his words meandering from the weather to memories of their youth. The world had claimed his story, but Harold had no desire to be a symbol. He was simply a husband keeping his promise. But one spring morning, Harold received an unexpected phone call. It was from the producers of Family Feud. They wanted to bring him back for a special episode. Steve Harvey himself had insisted. "We have something that belongs to you, Mr. Harold," the producer said cryptically. Harold was reluctant. He never liked fanfare, but his family urged him to go. Emma reminded him, "Grandpa, sometimes the world needs reminders. Maybe this is one of those times." And so Harold agreed. When Harold walked once more onto the Family Feud stage, the atmosphere was electric. This was no ordinary taping. The audience rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation before a word had been spoken. The applause was deafening, and Harold, though humbled, raised his hand in a small, dignified wave. Steve Harvey, his eyes already glistening, shook Harold's hand with both of his. "Mr. Harold, welcome home," he said, his voice trembling. The game that day was secondary. Everyone knew the true purpose was Harold himself. Steve allowed the show to flow lightly, with laughter and easy questions, but the tension built toward the moment everyone had been waiting for. Finally, Steve's tone shifted. He looked straight at Harold. "Mr. Harold, you once told us about the first morning you met Dorothy at that coffee shop in Portland. You said she wore a blue apron that day. Well, we went looking, and we found something we think belongs to you." From backstage, a young woman walked forward carrying a small glass case. Inside it, neatly folded, was a faded blue apron. Harold's breath caught. His hand flew to his mouth. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His legs trembled, and Emma rushed to steady him, tears already streaming down her face. Steve explained, "This is the very apron Dorothy wore when she worked at that coffee shop in 1956. The owners kept it all these years, and today we're giving it back to you." Harold reached into the case with shaking hands. He lifted the apron, held it to his face, and closed his eyes. For a long moment, the studio was silent, save for the muffled sobs of the audience. When Harold finally spoke, his voice was thick with wonder. "I can still smell her perfume," he whispered. "After all these years, she's still here." Steve Harvey, overcome, turned away from the cameras to hide his tears, but they streamed down anyway. The audience erupted into applause, but this time it wasn't loud. It was tender, as though they were clapping for a memory too fragile to disturb. Harold stood there, the apron pressed against his chest, his back straight, his face aglow with memory. And then he turned to the audience. His voice, though quiet, carried across the room with the authority of a man who had lived long enough to know what truly mattered. "If you love someone," Harold said, pausing to steady his breath, "do the small things. Make the coffee, leave the note, say good morning, give the kiss. Because one day, those small things will be all you have left. And when that day comes, you'll realize those small things were the biggest things all along." The studio erupted again, but this time it was not applause alone. It was people sobbing, holding each other, shouting "Amen" and "Yes, sir," as though Harold had delivered a sermon. Steve Harvey himself stood beside him, microphone forgotten, and simply placed an arm around the old man, letting the words echo through the hall. From that day forward, Harold's words were quoted everywhere, on news broadcasts, in church sermons, and wedding vows. Couples renewed their promises with Harold's phrase etched into their ceremonies. Coffee shops printed it on their walls. The apron, now framed, hung in the Portland Cafe, renamed Dorothy and Harold's, a reminder to every customer that love does not live in grand gestures, but in the devotion of daily rituals. Back in Portland, Harold returned to his quiet routine. Every morning at 6:45, he still poured 2 cups of coffee. Only now, when he sat at the table and looked at Dorothy's chair, he also looked at the apron hanging on the wall, gifted back to him by the show. It gave him comfort, as if the fabric itself carried her presence, her laughter, her warmth. And so, the ritual continued. The alarm rang. The kettle whistled. 2 cups clinked gently against the wooden table. Harold spoke softly into the silence, but he was never alone. His story had reminded millions that love, once rooted deeply, could never be erased by time or death. Steve Harvey summed it up best, his words broadcast in the episode's closing moments. "Real love doesn't live in the grand moments. Real love lives at 6:45 in the morning in 2 cups of coffee, in promises kept across the boundary of death itself. That's what Harold and Dorothy have shown us. That's what forever looks like." And somewhere in Portland, a 90-year-old man continued to prove that truth each and every morning, 1 coffee cup at a time.